Hello and welcome to our web chat. We are joined by Paul Stheeman, founder and CEO of Senior Treasury Solutions, who provides corporate treasury strategy and support, and Tom Jack, former Senior Treasury Director Mondelez, who's got multi-sectorial corporate treasury experience across many business cycles and has been a group treasurer of 3 FTSE 100 companies. And we're going to be discussing a major issue in companies today, debt compliance, how to make it easy to manage. Before we start, Paul, first question though is, what scale of borrowing does this apply to?
Thank you, Jack. In my opinion, this applies to almost all borrowings above a threshold of, let us say, roughly £1 million or euros. Amounts below that tend to be easier. The language and the requirements of the banks tend to be a little bit less. But anything above that can, and of course it will depend a little bit on the credit quality of the borrower. So any amount above that, and there's no limit to the upside, will be subject to some kind of intensive debt management by the treasurer or someone responsible for treasury activities.
Managing this problem, and I know it's a problem, I have talked about it with many other treasurers. First question really is, why do many treasurers dislike loan agreements?
Well, there's several reasons for that, Jack. The first one is that a loan agreement is not really something like a thriller which you would pick up at your local bookstore. It usually contains difficult legal language. The documentation can go up to over 500 pages. And depending on the type of company you are in, let us say if you're working as a treasurer for a private equity-owned company which has been given a lot of debt in the form of a carve-out, the treasurer will not really have been involved in the negotiations up front. And the actual wording of the loan agreement can and will lead to restrictions on the day-to-day treasury management of the company and its subsidiaries.
Tom, do you agree with that? I think you feel it's an essential part of life.
Yeah, I'm broadly in agreement with Paul. Thank you, Jack. I think the treasurers, it's not so much that treasurers dislike loan agreements, but it's probably not the most enjoyable of a treasurer's responsibility. Documentation does tend to be lengthy. I think of it almost as a necessary evil. Usually when you're having to deal with complicated loan agreements, it's because you're having to borrow a lot of money and probably you're in quite a highly leveraged situation. Usually the higher the leverage, the tighter the constraints on the activity of the organisation and especially on the cash flow. And that's where you have to be very, very careful when you're going through a loan agreement, is to understand exactly what the constraints are and how you satisfy the sensitivities of the lender.
Paul, you're sort of saying in the next point that you don't need to read the whole agreement. Surely not.
Well, I would admire anyone who actually does read such an agreement from the beginning to the end, because it is, as we have just said, full of very difficult language and difficult to understand. I personally have found that the best way to understand such an agreement is to read individual clauses from whenever you need them. For instance, most loan agreements follow a similar structure and a similar pattern in the way they have been written. So you know where to find your clauses. They all begin with definitions and then move on to different requirements. And if you take this clause by clause, as you actually need them and as you require them, then you probably are going to understand the agreement better than when you try to read the whole thing from the beginning to the end.
But Tom, the stakeholders have different requirements, don't they?
Yeah, I think the stakeholders do have different requirements. I mean, just coming back to the previous point, unraveling the agreement, I do agree with Paul, but it depends on the length of the agreement. If you've got a document which is 600 pages long, then it's going to be very, very difficult and probably not very helpful to go through all of it. In a usual corporate environment, not such a highly leveraged environment, probably your documentation is going to be around about 100 pages. Going through the index and then picking out the different clauses as and when you need them, I think is a very good approach, especially when you're inheriting documentation that's already been put in place. As to your stakeholders, crucial stakeholders really are your legal advisors, because they're going to be the people who do this for a full-time job. A treasurer, this is part of your wider responsibilities, but your legal advisors, they do this for a day job. And the administration and the security agents, those are the guys that you're interacting with on a regular basis in order to meet the requirements of the documentation. And so a good relationship with both those groups is essential.
How do you manage the C-level executives and the other internal departments?
It's necessary to engage them. I mean, from the C-level executives, it's highly likely that you're going to be supported by them in any case, simply because they will have an own interest in ensuring that the terms of the loan agreement are always met. In all likelihood, they will have signed the agreement themselves, and they will also be personally liable to ensure that the company actually adheres to the terms. So you shouldn't have any issues there. Quite often, however, operating units are not fully aware of the terms of the loan agreement. They won't have been directly involved from the outset. They will be aware, in particular if they are guarantors to the agreement, they will be aware that they have a role in there. But the actual detailed responsibilities which they have, they are not going to be, it's unlikely that they will understand the day-to-day requirements. And it is essential that the treasurer explains this to them and lets them know what their roles are and where they have to adhere to the terms as well.
So it's a complicated process, and my mind boggles with 500-page agreements. But what can you do to make the treasurer's life easier, Paul?
I found that it is very helpful for the treasurer to develop some tools himself, which provide him with a certain amount of confidence that he is meeting the main terms of the agreements.
And does he get this out of his TMS, or does he have to develop it himself?
No, he will have to develop this himself. These are normally Excel-based models, which he will have to develop to take into consideration the terms of the loan agreement. Now, I'm not talking about what I would call simple things like the payment dates, interest payment dates, and that kind of thing, but about the more complex issues around covenants and baskets, which you will not find in a TMS.
Tom, what's your experience here? Because this sounds really quite complicated.
It is. It's very complicated, but it's fundamental. It's one of the most important things. If you fall foul of your covenants, then there are various degrees of seriousness of that, but it can lead all the way up to an event of default. In my experience, putting in place a covenant calculation model is vital. In the previous point, Paul touched on the education, communication, and that's very important. You're the specialist. You have to educate the organisation about what they can and can't do. And just about every organisation I've worked for, the calculation of the covenants has been done through a series of Excel spreadsheets and gathered at an operational level. And it's not only that you can't pull this information directly from a TMS, sometimes it's very difficult to pull it from your normal accounting system as well.
Exactly, Tom. If I may just add to that, the reason why it's so difficult is that the wording of the covenants may actually mean or lead to a different calculation of certain points like EBITDA, just to take one example, than your accounting system will often provide you with.
And who provides the figures?
It will depend, or it will vary from company to company. But I would say as a general rule, it should come from the controller or someone similar to the controller who has access to the accounts and knows how to pick up the individual items which you will have developed and asked him for within the model.
So moving on, the basket calculation model, what does that refer to? Why is that an important tool?
Well, that is an important tool because quite often, when you look at these loan agreements, you are actually, to start off with, you're not allowed to do anything anymore. Now, that obviously is going to have a very serious effect on your day-to-day business. So loan agreements contain baskets which allow the borrower to enter into transactions up to certain limits. For instance, it's quite often that guarantees can be issued up to a certain amount. Now, let us say you have several subsidiaries. If each subsidiary were to go out and get a guarantee by himself, then you as treasurer of the group would not have the opportunity to understand, well, what is my total obligation? So here the treasurer has to develop a model according to which all entities in the group report certain financial transactions for which a basket has been granted in the loan agreement, and to ensure that the whole group remains within the basket provided by the lenders. And failing to do so can, as Tom mentioned a few minutes ago, in the worst case, lead to default.
Tom, is there a particular lesson from your experience here in using basket calculations?
Yeah, I think the major point with a basket calculation is you've got to have a policy in place such that anything that impacts on any of your baskets within your loan documentation has to have the pre-approval of the Treasury function. If the business isn't aware of those constraints and it goes off and in the situation that Paul described, 4 different subsidiaries all go out and have a guarantee, once that's reported into the centre, it's too late because you've already breached your basket and you'll need to approach your lenders and negotiate your way out of that. Not a very comfortable position to be in. So policy constraints for me is the most important lesson that I've learned personally.
Okay, and then moving on, the loan calendar is clearly important. What's the most important features here, Paul?
The important thing is to capture anything which in the loan agreement has to do with a particular date or time. Quite simply, things can be overseen or overlooked. For instance, it's less repayment dates. Most people have those on the radar screen, and interest payments as well. But there are other items such as reporting deadlines, which can within the loan agreement also vary. There can be other deadlines for specific actions which the borrowers have to fulfill. There's several things there, and it's important to capture all of them and to ensure that the entire Treasury Department and the CFO for that matter have a copy of this calendar so that they simply have the comfort, okay, we are on top of all important dates.
But Tom, surely that would be much easier inside a TMS, or is it still required outside of a TMS?
Yeah, well, I think as Paul said, a lot of the data is going to be within the TMS. Your repayment dates, your interest payment dates. It's the certification deadlines which is more difficult to put into a treasury management system, or where you have to rely on a manual calendar note. Typically, the certification is within a set time frame, maybe 4 weeks of the end of a particular period, whether it's quarterly or semi-annually or annually. And it is difficult to put those into a treasury management system. And anyway, those reporting deadlines, I think, need to be owned by the whole organisation, the controllers, the CFO, rather than just residing within the treasury management system and within the treasury function.
And that also applies surely to the internal compliance certificate that you mentioned here, Paul. That also needs to be up front.
Yes, exactly, it does. The reason why I consider this to be an important document, and that is the CFO of the company will have to sign and send off to the agent at regular intervals, a compliance certificate. This compliance certificate, however, contains comments and confirmations pertinent to the entire group. Now, the CFO will want to be sure that each operating unit, in particular if they are a guarantor to the loan agreement, is compliant as well, and therefore will take the appropriate clauses out of the compliance certificate and ask the CFOs or the finance managers of their subsidiaries to actually sign off and confirm that each individual subsidiary is compliant as well. A CFO will want this to be able to sleep well at night when he signs off that compliance certificate.
Tom, does this compliance certificate make you sleep better?
It certainly does, and I think that the CFO, he's on the hook for this documentation. He's on the hook for ensuring that the company meets its obligations, and this is a great way to get each of the individual elements of the business to have a really good hard think about the accuracy of the statements that they're making and also their completeness. And if they're signing on the dotted line and handing that over to the ultimately to the finance boss of the organisation, it's a great way for people to make sure that they're doing the appropriate amount of diligence on it.
The one thing about debt compliance that this web chat has shown is how it's not easy. It needs to be done on a number of different levels, but clearly there are important lessons to make it easy to manage. Basically, the treasurer is responsible, but does this methodology for debt compliance apply to all types of borrowing, or is it only particular types?
Not all types. It will depend very much on the wording, but you will find it quite often in loan agreements, which we have been discussing today, but you will also see that it can be appropriate, perhaps with a few twitches, but it can be appropriate for bond issuances, any kind of public debt.
Tom?
Yeah, I think there's every single loan agreement that you take out is going to have some constraints. So you're constrained as soon as you borrow any money. The key issue here is that the higher the level of gearing, the higher the level of leverage, the more constraints that any lender will want to put onto you. And so the more complicated your debt compliance becomes.
Yes, I agree entirely there, Tom.
Thanks, guys. Really interesting insights into a horrendously difficult problem as far as I'm concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Jack. It's been a pleasure.